Whether that's home DIY, whether that's cooking, whether that's interior design, whether that's fashion stuff, whether it's religious stuff, whether it's leadership, what are you becoming a student of? Because God will call you to become a student and learn your passion. So, my grandmother has this saying. She would be like, don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. And I honestly feel like I'm going to have to call her soon and be like, you know what? I think it's a little bit too late for me. But on this episode of the Heaven in Mind podcast, I'm going to be sharing my journey to how we got here. But before we get into the thick of my journey here, I just figured if we're going to be fellowshipping together for at least a couple of more episodes, we might as well not be strangers. So I want to share 10 fascinating facts about myself. Number 10, I have worked in the field of youth development for over 10 years. I own 9 pairs of flannel pants, and yes, I do wear them all year round. On a scale of 1 to 10, I am a solid 8 for how much of an introvert I am. But I was a Sunday school teacher for 7 years. I did 6 years of college, 3 in undergrad, 3 in grad school, and I typically wear the same 5 pieces of jewelry almost every day. This is not my first time podcasting. My previous podcast had 4 seasons. My 3 favorite things to wear are a hat, a hoodie, and some headphones, which is the reason why I always travel with at least 2 pairs of headphones, and I will panic if I don't have 1 tube of lip chap. So if you ever wonder why I record these episodes wearing hoodies in the house, I probably got on flannel pants. I'm living my best life. This episode, I'm going to be talking about how I got here. And along the way, I hope to also give you some tips on how you can track your own journey to where God may be leading and taking you. So here are the 7 things that have happened over the course of my life that I believe were stepping stones for God getting me here. The first one is limited questions. So this is a running joke in my family. This is a running joke just with people anywhere. And I tell this story all the time. So if you listen to the old podcast, you've heard it. But when I was a child, my mother limited me to 7 questions a day. And that's not even like a made up good for podcasting story. That was my reality. My mother limited me to 7 questions a day because she said I was one of those kids who was like, well, why is the sky blue? Well, why is the grass green? Now, I don't remember being that bad. I'm not saying that my mama lied about it. I'm just saying I don't remember. But she limited me to 7 questions a day. Then it got to the point where I had stipulations on the kinds of questions that I could ask. So not only could I only ask 7, of the 7, I was not allowed to ask what was going to happen in the future. So any questions that I asked where I was like, Mom, what we gonna do tomorrow? And she would literally look at me and be like, Jasmine. And then that's all she would say. She wasn't, I already knew. Like when she called me by my government name, it was a wrap. Like she was not having it. And so she literally would not answer any questions that I had about what was gonna happen tomorrow, next week, next month. And I have always been preoccupied with what's going to happen in the future. Now, she says I worry about it a lot. And as I'm getting older, I can see where that comes from. It's a thin line between preoccupation and worry. And I have to pray about that sometimes. But I have always had my eyes fixed on the future just because even as a young child, that is what I thought about. I thought about the future. I asked questions about the future. So when it comes to where God is leading you, my first tip is this: go back to your childhood. Because for me and for many children, some of the obnoxious characteristics about us point to purpose. And so that's what often manifests is like we're annoyed at the kid who won't sit down, the kid who won't stop arguing, the kid who's all over the place, the kid asking 50 questions. And yet, it probably speaks to purpose. When I think about Simone Biles' story, her mom was like, even as a kid, she was flipping off couches and flipping off tables and just, flipping everywhere. And I have kids now who are always upside down. And I'm like, what are you doing? And then I have to stop and I think and be like, there's something to that. So go back to your childhood and figure out what was that thing? What kind of child were you? If you're really struggling with trying to find your purpose, go back and figure out what was significant about me as a child. Because when you look at the fact that God did not ask us what year we wanted to be born, we didn't get to pick what city we lived in or what family we had or who our parents were or how many siblings or the birth order. All of that was divine providence. God did what he wanted to do, and then you showed up. And so, in his divine providence, there are other things that he put in you that would manifest themselves in different seasons of your life. And so, go back to childhood and figure out what those things are. And that will be, I believe, the first stepping stone to you finding your purpose. The second thing for me is in high school. I remember going through my mother's bookshelf and I found the first book of the Left Behind series. Now, this was around the big Y2K phenomenon. This would have been late 1999, early 2000, 2001. So everybody thought the world was coming to an end. Y2K was coming, all the computers was going to crash. Everybody was stocking up on water. It looked like COVID, pre-COVID. So it wouldn't have been out of the ordinary for me to read a book like that at that particular time. But again, I'm in high school reading books voluntarily about the end of the world. And so that is also a time when I grew to love reading. So I read the first book and I was hooked. And then I would go to the library to check out the other books. Now, some of y'all probably don't know nothing about the library, but I made sure my library card was always active so I could go and check out the rest of the Left Behind series books. And what that did for me was it laid a fictional storyline under end times prophecy. So I wasn't studying end times at that particular point. I was only a freshman, sophomore in high school. But what it did do for me was it gave me characters, it gave me imagery, it gave me a storyline, it gave me basic understanding of end time prophecy. And so the second suggestion that I have for you when it comes to how to find the pieces or put the pieces together for where God may be taking you, what is that media that has changed your life? I believe that when we encounter life-changing media, whether that's books, whether that's movies, podcasts are on the rise. Who are you listening to? What are those quotes that are really impactful? But when we get exposed to media that changes the trajectory of our lives, I think we need to pay attention. So what are those for you? What is that life-changing movie you saw? What is that book that you read that you never forget? What is that thing that you heard or got exposed to that totally shifted your mindset about something? Those are things that you need to pay attention to because God may be using that very media to shift and change the direction of your life. So not only go back to childhood, but also pay attention to the things that really strike you deeply when it comes to media that you have been exposed to. And for me, the first thing was the Left Behind series. Say what you will about it. It's a wonderful series. Rest in peace to Dr. Tim LaHaye. Then the third piece for me, after my limited questions, after the Left Behind series, is when I really felt like God was intentional about me learning. I had the Left Behind series as a fictional backdrop. Right? Because we all love stories. Even when you don't understand stuff, we love stories. This is the reason why Jesus often spoke in parables so that people could understand. So I had this storyline. I had these characters. I had these events in this book and in this series of books. And then I feel like God was like, now I need you to actually learn it from the biblical standpoint. So by the time I became like a junior or senior in high school, I started going to adult Bible study at my church. So I kind of ditched youth ministry because I was like, I feel like I'm learning more in the adult Bible study. And so I started going to Bible studies on Wednesdays. And my pastor at the time, he did like a couple of weeks. It was like 6 weeks or something of like an in-depth end time study. And I mean, I was on cloud nine when he was doing that. Like, just the deep dive. I mean, I remember I had an orange folder. I wish I could find the orange folder. I was taking notes. I had all the handouts. I had everything. Like, I was on cloud nine because now God was adding biblical scripture to the storyline that I had. So the whole time that my pastor was like talking about it and teaching, I was like, so that's what they meant. Like, oh, that's what they meant. Oh, like this was like real. This is in the Bible. So the biblical teaching that I got seemed to back up the books that I had read. And then the books that I had read had allowed me to understand the Bible that was being taught. And so when God put those two things together for me, I mean, you could have just stuck a fork in me. I was done. I was like, yes, this is life. And so fast forward 10 years later, God sent me to seminary school so I could learn how to study the Bible myself. I didn't take any, specifically eschatological classes. It came up from here and there. But really, what I took away from seminary school was some tools in which to help me study the Bible deeper, to be able to not be afraid of tackling some of the things, where to go to find commentaries, how to do your word studies, different things like that. So that way I could start to learn some of these things for myself. I could become a critical thinker and engage in these topics on a different level and start to form my own belief system around that, which you'll hear a lot of as the episodes move forward. And so that learning was key and critical for me. And so the third thing that I would encourage you to do is to stop and assess, what are you a student of? When you're trying to figure out your purpose, you have to figure out, what are you naturally gravitating towards in your free time? What are you Googling in your free time? What are you watching YouTube videos about in your free time? What are you typing how to do during your free time? What are those things, even on your job, that you gravitate towards every time they have a class on this or they send you to a training on this? You're like, yes, I want to go to that. I want to learn more about that. And you kind of become obsessed with that. Whether that's home DIY, whether that's cooking, whether that's interior design, whether that's fashion stuff, whether it's religious stuff, whether it's leadership, it's all of those different things. What are you becoming a student of? Because God will call you to become a student and learn your passion. You have to take the gifts you've been given and develop them. And that comes with learning. And so when you are intentional about learning about your passion, not just, oh, I like music, but you are learning about music, then you are probably well on your way to whatever it is that God has for you. So for me, not only was it Limited Questions, the Left Behind series, God calling me to learn, but the fourth thing for me was I got laid off. And I found myself in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable season in the middle of a pandemic. And so, for the first couple of weeks, it was wonderful. I can sleep late. I can watch movies. I can stay in the house. These people, they want me to stay at home, right? That's an introvert's dream. You want me to be at home for like days on end. I was loving it. But after a while, it was like, okay, well, you're going to have to find something to do every day. And so I was like, you've got to have some kind of project. I always keep some project going. And so I had the idea previously to do a podcast with a friend of mine. She turned me down. So the idea came back up and was like, well, get into podcasting. So I was like, well, that's cool. I was a teacher, I still have ideas, to keep me accountable for studying, right? So still got to get in my word to be able to share, have something to share with the people. And so I took up podcasting. I bought like a $60 microphone from Walmart, had it delivered to the house, plugged it into my computer. The first couple of episodes of the Mind Time podcast had terrible sound, but I was podcasting, and at the same time, I was on YouTube learning about how to podcast. What do you do? Equipment that you use. What are some of the best practices? How do you do thumbnails? How do you edit? And that's the thing God does. I had the equipment, right? Because I was a marketing major in my undergrad. So I had the Adobe Creative Suite. I ain't used nothing really but Illustrator and like Photoshop every now and again, or InDesign. But I had all these like editing programs that I never used before. So I got on there, okay, how do you use Adobe Audition? How do you use these different programs? And again, I became a student. I had to learn about podcasting even to start podcasting. And so I started the Mind Time podcast in April 19th, 2020. It just really impressed upon my heart that God was like, this is something that you really need to look at. So when I got done being mad about being laid off and just kind of embraced this season of, you have time to do this. You got all the time in the world to do this every day. You need to produce something for yourself. That's what that anger about getting laid off, I think, really instilled in me, was just this whole idea of you need to start building something for yourself, because on any given day this company can say we don't need you, and then you're just out here. And it wasn't even about the money. I'm not making any money off podcasting at this point, but it was just about having something that somebody could not take away from me. And that was really important for me when I started the first podcast. So being laid off, and God kind of using that unfamiliar season for me in order to change, again, the shifting of my idea of what teaching looked like. I wasn't going and showing up at 9 o'clock every Sunday morning to teach the young adults or teach the high school students. Now I was just sitting behind a microphone in my house and sharing a message. And I really loved it because, I could sit in my hoodie and my flannel pants inside the house, and it was wonderful. But pay attention in those seasons where you're just like, well, God, now what am I supposed to do? Now where am I supposed to go? Now how is this going to work out? Because you're really struggling with purpose and these unfamiliar seasons that you're in. You got to ask God, are you trying to shift what I'm already doing a different way? Or God may just be saying, do something totally different. Both of those things can be options. But again, pay attention to those seasons. Because a lot of times we get so frustrated with God because we're in a season that we don't like, that we miss the purpose of the season. So in the midst of podcasting, in the midst of trying to figure out this new normal, my grandmother passes away. So the fifth thing for me is the loss of loved ones. Losing people over the last couple of years has been significant for me in terms of how I got here, because the reality of heaven reignited something in me that was like, no, this is really what I want to talk about. And in the Mind Time podcast, I feel like I skated around it because, again, I lacked the acceptance that this is something that God has placed in me that I'm very passionate about. And it's weird because most people ain't sitting up talking about heaven, not on a day-to-day basis. But losing my grandmother really sparked something in me that brought me back to, this is what I want to talk about. And I became obsessed again with consuming information because I have now lost someone that was really close to me. Fast forward, my grandfather passed away in April of 2021. So all of my grandparents had been living up until that point, and then I lose two of them back to back. And so then again, you've got this grief, you have this passion for heaven and evangelism. And so losing loved ones started to come out in some of my other relationships. So I had friendships that suffered because now I was like on this are you saved kind of kick, and in ways that I had never really been. But that's just where I was at. And when you look at the world and COVID is happening and stuff, I wasn't thinking, oh, the world is about to come to an end. But it was just the reality of, we're watching people die every day. We're watching on TV every day the numbers change, and we're marking milestones. We had 1,000 people die. We're at 100,000. We're at 500,000. Are we going to reach 1 million by next week? I mean, this is craziness. And so for me, it really was like, are the people that I love good? And so I had some tough conversations, and it was some people who wasn't really all that happy and thrilled about this newfound, evangelistic, heavenly minded kind of kick that I was on. But again, that's just where I was. And so losing loved ones does something for you on a deeper emotional level. And so the fifth thing that I have for you is just pay attention to the feelings that you feel when you suffer loss. And that doesn't just have to be loss of people. That could be the loss of job, the loss of relationship, the loss of friendships. So the loss of traditions. We couldn't gather like we wanted to gather. And so we had a lot of feelings and emotions, I think, as a country, as a world. What do those things bring up for you? For some people, it's grief. For some people, it's anger. Some people struggled with depression. Some people, it was hopeful because in the loss of the job, they became entrepreneurs or business people or whatever. What did that grief bring up for you? Pay attention to that, because whatever you lean to also speaks to passion. So if during the pandemic you've discovered your love for cooking, that ain't my ministry on no day. I'm just saying. My sister has taken that up since my grandmother has passed away. But that's what she leaned towards. That's what she gravitated towards. I was over here with my nose in a book asking more questions. And so when you suffer those kinds of losses, again, pay attention to what does that spark for you, and lean into that, because God will often use that as well when it comes to moving you closer to your purpose. The sixth thing for me was a love of self. Coming into 2022, I was just at a standstill. Still processing grief in some real ways. Had got to the place where the podcast had kind of stalled. I wasn't really excited about it anymore. I was struggling with changing the logo, changing the color. Should we change the name? There was just a lot of decisions that needed to be made. And so I was just like, we're just going to pray about it. So my whole last season of my previous podcast was a prayer season. We just prayed about some of everything. And even though I mentioned it in like one of the prayers and asked people to pray for me about it, I could not pinpoint what it was as to why I was like, it felt restless. So we had been praying about it. I came into 2022 thinking, okay, it's just a little hiatus. I stopped recording in November of 2021, which is normal for the holidays. And then I usually come back in February. Well, by February, God hadn't answered none of the prayers. I still didn't know if we was going to change the name. I didn't know if we were going to change the logo. I had been praying and begging and looking at stuff, and I was just like, got nothing. I literally got nothing. And so February comes and I'm like, all right, so maybe we'll aim for the summer. So I'm still thinking like this is going to be a thing. But simultaneously, I also came into saying I need to heal. So I was having lunch earlier in the early part of the year with a friend and a mentor of mine. And I was like, my goal for this year is just to heal. I don't know if I'm going to accomplish a whole lot of anything this year, but I just know I need to heal. I knew my mind was not in the right place. I think some of that was still unprocessed grief. I was all over the place with the podcast. Work was going through some things. My friendships were suffering because I was in this new season of my life. I was just everywhere. And I was like, I need to heal. So I knew I wanted to get back into counseling, which I did in early March. I got back into counseling and I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to get my mind right. Everything's going to be good. Everything's going to get back to rolling. That did not happen. Because come June, my sister gets married and they have a destination wedding in Jamaica. And so me having way too much fun, we get on an inflatable raft behind a speedboat. I mean, we're living our best lives and I'm not holding on because I'm trying to film it. We hit a curve and a wave simultaneously and I get flipped off the boat head first into the water, which gave me like whiplash and sprained my neck and all these things. So by the time we come back, I can't even hold my neck up. And so go to the doctor, do all that. I end up having to go to physical therapy for the second half of the summer every week. And so now it's like you've got the mental healing. I'm going to counseling. I've got physical healing. I'm PT because of my injury. And God is still saying nothing about this podcast. And so in the midst of all of that, trying to heal mentally, trying to heal physically, God is also walking with me through spiritual healing. I did not anticipate when I said I need to heal, it being the culmination of all the things that God has had to walk me through in 2022. And so I realized all of this healing happening at the same time also brought up the issue of needing to love myself more and embrace a higher level of self-acceptance. And again, that was something else that I did not really know that I needed. But as I look back, I can see why God wasn't saying anything about the podcast, because God was like, you need to accept this passion that I've given you. You need to embrace these steps that I've brought you on to get you to this point. And you need to be okay with talking about what I put on your heart to talk about. And you can't do that if you're still judging yourself for it. If you're still just like, this is weird. If you're still like, well, ain't nobody talking about that. Well, if nobody's talking about it, this is the reason why you need to talk about it. And so I had to get to a place of loving myself, accepting myself, embracing myself to even have the courage to start this podcast which is more along the lines of what I want to talk about anyway. And so I realized that God had to do a work in 2022 in me, a whole lot of healing that he's continuing to walk me through just to get me to this place where I'm sitting in front of you talking about keeping heaven in mind. My question to you, the sixth thing is, where do you need to embrace more of who you are? What is God calling you to embrace about yourself that you think is odd or weird? What is that message that you want to share that you think nobody wants to listen to? What is that passion that you're trying to suppress because you don't know what to do with it? Lean into those things and then figure out, is there some healing that God is trying to do in your life to get you to a place of acceptance where you say, forget what other people think about it. This is the path that I'm on. These are the steps that I've taken. This is how my life has led me here, and I'm going to walk in that. So love of self and self-acceptance are vitally important when it comes to living out your God-ordained purpose, because as I heard somebody say one time, God cannot bless who you pretend to be. He can only bless who you are. And so when I look back at my previous podcast, I learned a lot. I was able to practice a lot. I feel like I've grown a lot through that season. But the reason why I felt like it needed to end is because God was like, this watered down version of yourself that you're presenting is not what I need to fully communicate the message that I put on your heart for such a time as this. And I just thank God for that. I thank God for 2022 and what he had to do to get me to this place. And so here we are with the Heaven in Mind podcast. The last thing is, I'm here because I'm looking at the state of the world. Now, I'm no theorist. I'm not one of those, the world is coming to an end. The Bible clearly says nobody knows. Even Jesus doesn't know. He said only the Father knows. I do think that there are signs, but the Bible also says these wars and rumors of wars and famines and plagues and pestilences are only the beginning of the end, right? These are the beginning signs of birth pains. And so when we look at the state of the world, you know, people who don't know better, just like, oh, Jesus is coming back. He is, and I can't tell you when. And it could be another 2,000, 4,000 years before that comes, right? The disciples thought Jesus was coming back during their day. So everybody's generation feels like they're living in the last days. And I don't think it'll be any different for us. But again, this is a reason why I feel like this is an opportune time to discuss heaven, because in the midst of all of the loss, all of the changes, all the pandemics, all of these things, you do have people who are kind of wondering about stuff. And then it's just kind of like, yeah, I see why you're concerned, but these really aren't even the signs you really need to be looking for. Like when this happens, that's when you probably need to be really concerned that something is about to go down. But where we're at right now is just the beginning of the end. And we've been in the beginning of the end for quite a number of years now. But when you look at the state of the world, one of the things that I do hope to do with this podcast is to just be able to challenge people to look towards heaven, to look towards Jesus, because this world is passing away. And when you're trying to find firm foundation, you have to find it in the thing or in the person who does not change. And that is only one person, and that is the person of Jesus Christ. He is the solid rock on which I stand, and which I hope you are standing. And if you're not, that you will come to learn to stand on, because everything else is sinking sand. And so this has just kind of been my journey of how I got here, through limited questions, through the Left Behind series, through learning, through getting laid off, through the loss of my loved ones, through learning how to love myself, and then looking at the world. This is how we're here. And so my hope is that as we continue to journey together, that you all will find value in the things that I'm sharing and be challenged to think about heaven in a more critical way, in a more consistent way, and in a more helpful way. And so as we unfold some more episodes, that is my hope and my prayer for this podcast and also for you.